Okay, sounds good. Thank you to the organizers, and thanks to everyone who's tuning in synchronously, or to the future people who are tuning in asynchronously. Today, I want to talk about an understudied Central Philippine language named Aklanon, or endonymically in Aklanon. Sorry, I need to hide myself. Okay. So I want to talk about Aklanon, and first I want to start by saying that Aklanon has the kind of prototypical Philippine type voice system that we're probably all very familiar with, where the voice affixes generally reflect the thematic role of a single discourse prominent argument, which I'm calling the topic. So in one, I show this, where we have Gintao it maestra sa ongaro libro. And this is kind of your canonical Philippine type clause. It's a patient voice clause. So the topic marked argument is the thematic patient. But the topic of this talk is going to be the event existential constructions, which unexpectedly seem to cleave this relationship between the voice and the case apart. So in 2, if we look at this event existential, we have the existential mai, followed by Gintao sa ongaro maestra. And here, the thing to note is that the patient voice affix no longer correlates to the topic marking, because the semantic agent is invariably topic marked here. So that's why I'm calling it case cleaving. It's kind of separating the case of the topic from the voice morphology on the verb. And this is an interesting effect in event existential constructions. And I'm going to argue that this effect is only superficial. And in particular, I'm going to argue that the complement of the existential is a relative clause. The topic marked argument is an argument of the existential, not an argument of the verb in the relative clause. And this topic marked argument of the existential controls pro, which is internal to the relative clause. So that's kind of the overview of where we're going. But first, I want to talk about some background and some assumptions. So Aklanon is spoken in Aklanon, the island of Panay. It has a relatively large speaker population, according to Ethnologue, and it's relatively understudied from a formal perspective. The only formal materials are descriptive from some time ago. Just generally, Aklanon is predicate initial, and it has argument scrambling, and the data that I'm presenting is the result of ongoing elicitation, which has been telephonic since the pandemic started, with a consultant who's lived in the US for several decades. And some assumptions that I'm making that I can't really talk in much detail about because of time is that there's a VP remnant movement operation, which is deriving verb initial syntax in Aklanon. I'm also assuming my analysis of event existentials is independent of and compatible with the major theories of Philippine type voice. And I'm going to adopt more descriptive terminology. So I'll be referring to the topic argument. And then the unmarked argument is whatever is not the topic, and then you have a dative or locative argument. And for reference, I give the entire paradigm across 4 voices here. I will also assume, following some work by Xie, that the relative clauses that I deal with in this talk are true relatives and not nominalizations, because they pass some tests. For example, they retain their argument structure, they retain voice morphology, and verbs undergo syncope in certain voices, which is a characteristic of verbs. So those are the assumptions. That's the background. Now let's look in a little bit more detail at event existentials. So the descriptive grammar of Tagalog by Schachter and Otanes describe these pretty meticulously. And then the first theoretical analysis that I find is by Lau 2010 under the name impersonal construction, followed by Aldridge 2011 and Adar 2013. So just to remind us of what we're talking about when we talk about event existentials, you have the existential verb followed by some constituent here and the topic marked argument, which doesn't correlate to that voice morphology. And so an analysis of event existentials really needs to address 3 questions. What is assigning case to the topic marked argument that is the semantic agent? What is this thing, the complement of my? And how is this topic construed as the agent of this thing? And these are the questions I will be addressing. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what's been done in Tagalog. So Lau 2010 argues that the complement of Tagalog mai is a relative clause, which is headed by a null noun. So you can see this here. And he uses evidence from a range of tests, but I just show pluralization. So for instance, whatever the complement of mai is in Tagalog, it can be modified by the numeral 2, and it can also be modified by mga, and it can be modified by some other things too. So that's one test that Lau uses to show that this complement of mai here is a nominal complement, a relative clause. But some limitations to this study is that Lau omits a systematic discussion of headed relative clauses, and also doesn't really propose a structure for the existential or derive the fact that the topic marked argument is construed as the agent here. Following Lau, Aldridge argues against the relative clause analysis because Tagalog apparently allows argument extraction out of the complement of mai. So if we look at some data from Aldridge's paper 2011, we see the dative argument to the man here is apparently extracted out of this complement of mai. And this is the dative argument of the ditransitive verb. Aldridge uses this to draw a very strong conclusion that the relative clause analysis must be rejected because it can't account for the expected lack of island effects in extraction from event existentials. Because if this were a relative clause, we would expect that it's subject to the complex NP island constraint, contrary apparently to the fact presented here. Instead, Aldridge proposes that the complement of mai, the existential, is a little VP, and that this is actually a raising construction. So I repeat Aldridge's structure here, and I just want to talk about a few components. First, I want to talk about the fact that the topic marked argument, the absolutive argument on this analysis, is raising out of external argument position of the embedded VP to the external argument position of the existential. And then this entire VP constituent is raising to the outer specifier of the little VP of mai up here, the existential. And then mai undergoes head movement to a higher projection to derive that surface word order. Some limitations to this study were that it doesn't really address externally headed relative clauses, and it also does not really account for Lau's adjunct modification facts, for instance, the plural facts. And then following Aldridge's analysis, Adar argues that Tagalog event existentials are not actually event existentials in the original sense of the term as it was proposed. And he advocates for a Lau type approach, but suggests that it might actually be a pseudo-relative construction rather than a relative clause construction. And Adar appeals to Trustwell's single event condition to explain the grammaticality of those those dative extractions from the existential complement. But some limitations are that Adar does not really propose a mechanism by which the topic is construed as the agent of the relative clause. So now we have a kind of overview of what's been done in Tagalog. We have these kinds of two analyses. You have the relative clause analysis and you have the VP raising analysis. So now we're in a position to turn to the present analysis, and I'm going to propose, like I said a little bit earlier, the complement of mai in Aklanon is a relative clause, a la Lau. And it can be free or headed, and it is not a little VP. And then I will argue that the topic marked argument is base generated as the external argument of mai. And then the case cleaving effect arises when a topic marked argument of mai actually controls a relative clause internal pro. And then verb initial syntax is kind of derived by a standard VP remnant raising operation of mai and its complement. So more specifically, the structure I'm proposing is given here. For this sentence, the teacher gave something to the child, where we have the teacher as the external argument of the existential. The complement of the existential is this headless relative. And then there's a pro in the external argument position of the headless relative, which the teacher is controlling, which is how you get that case cleaving effect. So first, let's look at some arguments for this relative clause component of this structure. The first argument following Lau is that if there is a headless relative in the event existential construction, it should be accessible to nominal modification. like in Tagalog. And so I've replicated Lau's evidence here, where we have mga, we have may mga gintao sa nga ro maestra. The teacher gave things to the child here. And on a relative clause analysis, where this thing is nominal, it's a relative clause, that fact follows pretty straightforwardly. You just have either a junction to the nominal layer, like I've shown, or maybe you have something like a number phrase, or something else. You can choose your flavor. But nevertheless, that fact follows pretty straightforwardly. And it's a little bit surprising because mga cannot normally modify verbs. I haven't shown the data here, but and then kind of similar logic to the pre-nominal modifiers with mga or the numbers. You can also get post-nominal modifiers. So in 11, I'm showing ginbasa ni Raul ro libro tungod sa akan. So of interest here is ro libro tungod sa akan. And this constituent about Aklanon, about Aklan. So because we can have this prepositional phrase modifying this noun, we kind of expect that we should also be able to get this in the complement of the existential if it's a relative clause. And we do. So you can have may tungod sa agan nga ginbasa si Raul. Raul read something about Aklan here. And again, on the relative clause analysis, that fact follows pretty straightforwardly. You just have this adjunction of the prepositional phrase to the nominal layer of this headless relative. And just a brief aside, if this complement of my were little vp, I think it's unclear where exactly to place this prepositional phrase in that structure, or how it would be interpreted at the left edge of the little vp or of the aspect phrase. So that's the first argument in favor of the relative clause analysis. The second argument in favor of this analysis is that headless relatives of this type in Aklanon are not limited to event existential constructions. So in 14 here, Maria likes what the child gave to the teacher. Of interest is the fact that this entire headless relative is the argument of this verb. And the thing to notice is that you basically just have the verb, its arguments, and they're introduced by this case particle, which is licensed by Naila. So this is another example of a headless relative and where it may occur in this language. And I want to point out that in these contexts, it's possible to have an overt head of this relative clause. So you can say, Naila si Maria ko libro nga gintao ko nga sa maestra, where libro here is the external head of this relative clause. And I'm assuming that the linker is a complementizer in C. And so what we see is that in argument position, you can get a headless relative. You can also get a headed relative. And so we expect that if the complement of my is a relative clause, this same headless alternation should obtain. And it does. We can also get an overt head in the complement of my. So you can have the teacher gave a book or some book to the child here with an overt external head of this relative clause. And so because the relative clause analysis is proposing that there's a relative clause there, this overlap between relative clauses in the language generally and relative clauses in this particular construction is captured pretty straightforwardly. You have the overt head here in this position in the nominal layer of the relative clause, and then you have the C linker there. The linker in C, sorry. And I think if the complement of the existential were a little VP, then this alternation, which seems to obtain in both argument positions with relative clauses and in the event existential as the complement of my, I think this kind of the parallelism would be kind of coincidental. And it may also require that my could take either a little VP, which would be a headless relative clause on this analysis, or a DP or NP, which would be the headed relative clause on this analysis, even though both of these produce the event existential interpretation. The third argument that I'd like to show is that Aldridge uses extraction, like I mentioned earlier, to argue that the relative clause analysis doesn't hold water for Tagalog. So the data that I repeat here is that the dative argument apparently can be extracted from this position, which seems to be an island violation. But in Aklanon, this kind of argument extraction seems to be ungrammatical. So I tried to replicate this as closely as I could in this construction, yeah, it came out ungrammatical. And I can show that this difference is truly due to extraction because the unextracted minimal pair to 19 is grammatical. And it's not really due to a prohibition about clause initial dative arguments because you can get that in a matrix clause also. So you can say to the child gave the teacher the book. So on the relative clause analysis, that fact that you can't get this extraction of the argument follows from the complex NP island constraint. The facts are a little bit more complicated about adjunct extraction, so you can ask about that in the Q&A if you like. The fourth argument in favor of this relative clause component is that it can be extended pretty straightforwardly to the negative event existentials, which haven't really been described for Tagalog. So I just want to present a few facts here. What is the negative counterpart to mai, and what requires an it marked complement here. And the same facts are true in negative event existentials. So you can get the positive version, which we've been looking at, or you can get the negative version here. And they're basically entirely the same. It's just that you get this it marking on the negative event existential. So on this analysis, the complement of mai will be this dp with an overt d and then the headless relative there. And it's also possible to get an overt head in this position, just like in the other cases that I showed. So those are four arguments in favor of the relative clause as a complement of mai. Now I want to talk briefly about how the topic is construed as the agent of this construction. Basically, because the ungrammaticality of argument extraction rules out raising because it seems to be an island, I posit obligatory control by the topic into the relative clause instead. So basically you have a pro as the external argument of the relative clause, which is bound by a local C commanding antecedent. And an advantage of this analysis is that it explains the ungrammaticality of topics in agent voice existentials, which I have not shown so far. I've only shown patient voice so far, and agent voice event existentials pattern distinctly because they block over topics. So for instance, in 26, you can say may nagtao it libro sa nga, which means someone gave a book to the child, but you cannot have an overt topic marked argument here. This is ungrammatical. You can't say the teacher gave a book to the child on this construction. And on the control analysis, the reason for this is that the complement of mai here is a relative clause. So to form the relative clause, you have to have operator movement. And because this is an agent voice relative clause, the operator needs to move from external argument position. And because the operator is occupying external argument position, pro cannot occupy that position. And if pro cannot occupy that position, then the introduction of an overt topic, which is looking for something to control, is ungrammatical. It looks for something and there's basically nothing to control, so that topic is uninterpretable. And a possible connection that I'd like to highlight here, kind of in the theme of Emily's talk just a minute ago, is that control into a relative clause like this is not theoretically classical. But I want to kind of point maybe a little bit speculatively to the genitive relative constructions in Polynesian, which Emily just talked about. So basically in these constructions, you can get a relative clause internal ergative subject, or you can get a relative clause external genitive subject. And one analysis of these constructions is that the genitive subject is outside of this relative clause and controlling a pro internal to that relative clause. And I think this is interesting because it's another example of maybe a typologically rare kind of control into relative clauses. And structurally, it seems a little bit different from Aklanon. But a potential avenue for further exploration is alluded to by the work by Adar in discussing work by Kaufman. So Kaufman argues that the existential my can actually be reconstructed with agent voice morphology. And points to the alternation between mai and kai in Tagalog. Aklanon doesn't have kai, but so the alternation between mai and kai as evidence for the agent voice morphology in the existential. In contrast, Ilocano and Kimarang existentials always assign genitive case to their possessor. So one idea that's kind of speculative is that the topic marked argument of mai actually begins as an oblique or genitive possessor and ascends to topic due to the agent voice morphology on the existential in Tagalog or in Aklanon. I leave this to future work, but I think it's interesting because if this is a tenable hypothesis, then maybe the Polynesian genitive relatives won't look so different from the event existentials. So to conclude, I've proposed an analysis of the event existentials in Aklanon, where the complement of the existential is a relative clause. The relative clause can be free or headed. And I've shown that those relative clauses appear generally throughout Aklanon syntax. I've argued that the topic marked argument is base generated as an external argument of mai, and the topic marked argument controls a pro internal to the relative clause. So I think this analysis extends easily to the negative event existentials and also opens up that possibility to explore connections to the genitive relatives. And to return to the questions earlier, these are the answers that I've given. And that's all I have. I think I'm just over time.
Thank you. So we have about 8 minutes for questions and comments. Hey, Edith, go ahead.
Hi, that was a really interesting talk, very clear and very convincing. And it's good to see that Aklanon is similar to Tagalog, but still different, and that you gave really good evidence that in Aklanon, anyway, you have a full relative clause structure. But I still would like to ask a little bit of clarification on the analysis itself. Like one of the things that you said was that the external possessor, the subject of mai, is looking for a pro to control. I don't really understand how the syntax is driving this looking for something to control operation from the controller itself. That's one thing. I can see how the pro might want to be controlled, but and then I guess presumably this construction is semantically ambiguous, right? So it could also, I mean, you could analyze the subject of mai as just a possessor, right? Like so-and-so has, a book that was given by someone to the teacher or something like that, right? Yeah. Instead of so-and-so gave a book to the teacher. Presumably both of these interpretations are possible, right?
I actually haven't been able to get really systematic judgments about the possessive interpretation from my consultant, but it is possible, yeah.
Okay, so if the possessive interpretation, presumably they want to put an overt subject down inside the clause, right, rather than a gap.
I don't have any data on that, so I can't really say.
Oh, okay. So then okay. So then I don't want to take up all the time. I just okay. Would like to know a little bit more about the mechanics of the analysis. Thanks.
Yeah. So I will go back up maybe to the, let me see where, here. Right. So the idea that I have, and I'm open to suggestions, is that putting the topic in the external argument position of the existential is not really enough for this to be interpretable. It has to be construed somehow as an argument. And if you have an agent voice of an existential, presumably where the operator is moving from the external argument position to create this kind of indefinite subject reading, then it seems like it's uninterpretable for there to be an overt topic which could only be construed as an agent in some way, clashing with this kind of operator movement, which is deriving an indefinite agent interpretation. And so maybe the way that I phrased it when I was explaining it in terms of the looking for is not quite right. But I'm thinking that it's, if you have the overt topic in the external argument position of the existential, and you also have the operator movement from the external argument position of the agent voice, then there's kind of a clash there, because the topic wants to be interpreted as the agent, but the operator is deriving an indefinite agent reading. And so that's kind of the idea that I have that's driving that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, then Harrison.
I think this was really cool. I guess I have maybe two things. One is a quick note about, right, I would agree with Edith in saying that it's interesting that Aklanon looks very similar to Tagalog, at least in this regard. And so I was wondering, at least for me, it's very hard in Tagalog to get an overt non-topic agent inside of the relative clause in these existential constructions. And maybe there is an effect of whether or not there is an overt nominal head for the relative clause. And so that might be worth looking into.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So and then I guess,
just to clarify, it would be a case where it's like everything down here, but then the agent is licensed with the expected case marking, like in an unmarked case or something like that here?
Yeah, like if you, instead of pro there, you would have basically a teacher, but with, I guess in your case, it would be, would it be it? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that might be worth looking more into. And then I guess I had some sort of thoughts about your speculation at the end. So again, in Tagalog, there's this thing that pronouns can do, that specifically genitive marked pronouns can do, so non-topic agents, where they can appear kind of phrase initially.
Okay.
So normally they will follow the verb or the noun that they're dependents of, but then they can also proceed. And then an interesting thing happens when you do this in relative clauses, is that they seem to appear really high. So so normally you would have something like pronoun, verb, and then other material, or pronoun, noun, and then other material, and those are construed as either the agent or the possessor. But if you have something that looks like a headless relative, you can have something like pronoun, plural marker, verb, etc., etc. And then the pronoun is still construed as the agent of, or at least it can be construed as the agent. Not, if it might be ambiguous, of the relative clause. And so I'm wondering if that might be some kind of, that might have something to do with what's going on in this existential construction.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds really interesting, and I'll follow up with you about it. I actually haven't really looked at the event existentials with pronominal arguments, so that is definitely an area that I can develop further, I think, in this work. Yeah. Thank you.
We're actually running out of time, so Hoffman, is your question really quick? If not, you can continue your discussion in Slack during the break. Problem. Okay.
And if anyone has any data about these event existentials in other languages, I would love to be in touch.
Do you want to say anything, Ben? No. And okay, we will finish this first half of session, and we'll have a short break for 15 minutes. So let's see you later.